Greetings and welcome back to Mastering the edTPA. This is video 8, the last video in our Task 1 series, and today we will be talking about the commentary. In order to write the commentary, we have to remind ourselves just how it fits into the overall task of Task 1. You begin with a central focus, a big idea that you're going to teach over 3 to 5 consecutive lessons. You write lesson plans for each of those days. You identify the assessments that you're going to use, the instructional materials you're going to use, and you use the context for learning document to identify and talk about the specific students in your classroom and their specific needs. But all of that is done before you do the commentary. The commentary is the connective tissue. It's where you explain, why are these the right assessments for these students? Why did I put these lesson plans in this order? How can I demonstrate that all of this is the right way to approach this central focus for my specific students? That's what the commentary is. Unfortunately for you, you don't have to figure this out on your own. It's very scaffolded, clear prompts. You don't have to make it up. So let's take a look at the Task 1 commentary. Before we begin, I need to remind you that I am using the elementary math commentary as an example here. I use that because that is what most students do, both in our program and in Washington State. Nevertheless, you should know that each commentary is slightly different. So if you are doing elementary literacy or secondary math or health and fitness, you need to look specifically at your commentary. The principles I am talking about here apply across the board, but the exact language is a little bit different in each one, and the slightly different questions will be asked. As I said, the principles remain the same, but the details are different. So please pay attention to your commentary. I even recommend that you have your commentary open as you watch this so you can track some of the differences. But as I said, the overall structure is the same. We begin with a central focus. What is the big idea that you're trying to teach? Describe it to us. And then in prompt 1, we look at the learning targets and the standards. How do these learning targets and standards promote, in this case, conceptual understanding, procedural fluency, and mathematical reasoning or problem-solving skills? That will be different. If you are not doing elementary math, you will have slightly different things. But you still have to talk about how do my standards and learning targets promote my discipline-specific understandings. In prompt 1C, you have to talk about how your plans build on each other. Why are they in this sequence? In lesson 2, how are we taking what we learned in lesson 1 and building on it? And then you notice that they tie that to discipline-specific knowledge. You will do the same for your discipline. And then finally, prompt 1D, the student understanding of learning targets. How are you communicating learning targets to students? If you haven't addressed that in your lesson plan, how are you going to do it? Explain it here. When will this happen? At the beginning of the lesson, the end of the lesson? How will you give them opportunities to show you that they understand? Now you might be thinking, well, I'm teaching kindergarten, so I don't have to do this. That is not true. This is for students of all ages that you will be possibly teaching with elementary math or whatever subject you are doing. They expect us to do this with all of our students, including special education. And that can be difficult and it takes some creativity, but it can be done. So this is prompt 1, and there are 5 prompts in task 1. And if you read these questions, you'll see they're fairly straightforward. This is not incredibly difficult. Explain why these learning targets are the right ones and how they're going to help promote these different things, and how am I going to communicate them to students. So I have a couple tips to help you succeed with prompt 1. I call them pro tips. The first is you need to use the language of the prompt in your response. So if the prompt is 1B, given the central focus, describe how the standards and learning target within your learning segment address conceptual understanding, you might want to begin with something like, the learning targets and standards within my learning segment address conceptual understanding by, etc. I know this is sort of back to 9th grade English, but I cannot express to you how important it is to use the language of the prompt. It does 2 things. It keeps you on track, keeps you from going off on a tangent, and it helps the reader know exactly which question you are answering at which time. So, word of the wise. You should address all parts of the prompt. You notice the bolded ands in 1B and in 1C. Oftentimes, students will address the first two and then leave the third one off. You will not score well if that happens. If it has an and, they want you to address all the parts of the prompt. So please do. And finally, there are some specific vocabulary terms in here. Conceptual understanding, mathematical reasoning, procedural fluency. What do those mean in an elementary math context? If you go to your handbook, the very end of your elementary math handbook, or whatever discipline you're doing, there is a glossary that defines these terms. Now, these terms will be different for each discipline or each endorsement, so you need to look to make sure you understand what they mean by those terms. You might have an idea of what you think conceptual understanding is, but you need to address it according to what they think it is. And the glossary is the place to look. That is at the end of the handbook, and that is true for every discipline. The second of our 5 prompts is about your students. Whereas prompt 1 asked you to reflect on the learning targets, the standards, and the sequence you've developed and how they relate to the concepts you are trying to teach or the skills you're trying to develop, prompt 2 asks what you know about your students and what they already know about this topic. So you'll see that in 2 there, before we get to 2A, it says, what do you know about your students with respect to the central focus? This is not a catch-all for everything you know about your students. What do they know about the central focus of your lesson already? And then it says in that highlighted section, consider the variety of learners. So when you're doing this reflection, you have to address not just sort of the bulk of the class, but if you have students that you identified in your context for learning as needing IEPs or 504s or having differentiated needs, what do they already know about it? Notice you're not talking about how you're going to differentiate yet. You're simply talking about what they already know. And so 2A asks about prior academic learning and prerequisite skills. Cite evidence of what students know, what they can do, and what they're still learning to do. When it tells you to cite evidence in the edTPA commentary, this is a clue that they're actually looking for you to refer to specific evidence. This could be prior test scores. It could be conversations you've had. It could be reports from other teachers. But you need to refer back to specific evidence of the student's performance. This is not the time to be guessing or to be very vague. This is the time to be specific. If you could actually quote test scores or refer to test scores or other performance data, that would be wonderful. It could be to the lesson you previously taught. If you're teaching on a Monday, you could refer back to the lesson you finished on Friday before. Nevertheless, you need to refer to specific performance data. And then 2B asks about your students' personal, cultural, and community assets related to the central focus. What do you know about their everyday experiences, cultural and language background, practices, and interests? For example, if you are in the greater Seattle area and you know that many of your students have parents who work at a tech firm and are highly educated in math, and you're doing elementary math, that might be worth mentioning that you have an educated parent base that is able to help support students. Conversely, if you're somewhere else where that's not the case, you might want to bring that up. What resources do they bring from home and from their outside lives that relate to the central focus? And then finally in 2C, it asks about your students' dispositions. How much do they believe that math is a worthwhile endeavor? How hard do they work, or how much do they feel they can succeed in math? How much do they believe in their own ability, their self-efficacy? You have to know your students. And the more specific you can be, both in description and in reference to your data, the better this will turn out. So again, pro tips. You need to be specific about your actual students. This is not the time for theoretical students or the abstract. Cite evidence. Refer, please, back to specific prior performance. And you need to address the students that you identified in your context for learning document. If it gives you that highlighted phrase, consider the variety of learners, it is cluing you in. You really need to be addressing the range of needs and the range of understanding and the range of abilities in your class when you answer these prompts. Prompt 3 is perhaps the meat and potatoes. And I don't mean that from a score perspective, but I mean from a marriage of the learning and the students. Prompt 3 is where it comes together. Supporting students' mathematics learning, or whatever your endorsement happens to be. You are going to support your justifications. Why did I make the instructional materials I made? Why did I have these activities in my lesson plans? Why am I assessing in these ways? Because I've already said, here's what students have to learn. And I've already said, here's who my students are, and here's what they already know. And now I have to justify, so why did I make these specific decisions for these specific students? If I said I'm going to use this worksheet, given what I already know about my students that I just described in prompt 2, why is this worksheet the right one to use? How does it meet the needs that I just described? How does it meet the prior knowledge that I just described? You cannot be too specific in this prompt. In 3A, it says, justify how your understanding of your students' prior academic learning, personal, cultural, and community assets, and mathematical dispositions from the previous prompt guided your choice or adaptation of learning tasks and materials. Be explicit about the connections between the learning tasks and students' prior academic learning, etc. When it tells you to be explicit, it means you should be quoting. You should be saying the connection between my students' prior knowledge, which was this, and the instructional materials, which is this, is as follows. You are going to be citing and quoting and making an explicit connection between the materials you've developed and the students in your room and their needs that you have just described. And as I said, and I'll say again, you cannot be too specific in this process. 3B asks, how will students know about these tools? You've created all these tools. How are students going to know they can use them? You will describe and justify in 3C why your instructional strategies and plan supports are appropriate for the whole class, or for individuals, or for groups with specific learning needs. And then again, we have that highlighted section. And then finally, 3D, describe common mathematical preconceptions, errors, and misunderstandings within your central focus. Now, this will be the same, I believe, for all disciplines. It won't be math. It will ask about preconceptions in your discipline. But this is an important thing. Where are students likely to make mistakes? If you are teaching fractions for elementary math, are they likely to confuse numerator and denominator, both the names and possibly the functions or values? If you think that's a likely misconception, you should address that here. There's a proactiveness, a proactive quality to this endeavor where before you teach this, you're going to identify, here's where I think students might get stuck. As always, there are pro tips. Please cite your lesson plans and other task 1 materials. It is asking you to explicitly make connections. You need to do that explicitly. Connect your decisions to the student performance that you described in prompt 2. If you referred back to specific test data which revealed that your students had only partial understanding of a topic, you need to address that and why that led you to create these specific instructional supports or make these specific instructional decisions. And like I just said for 3D, be proactive in addressing likely errors that students will make. Anticipate what is going to happen. Prompt 4 refers to academic language. With any discipline that students learn, they will be learning academic language as part of that. That might be vocabulary. It might be special symbols. For example, if you're teaching first grade math, you might be teaching students to write number sentences with a plus sign or a minus sign and the equals, or greater than or less than symbols. But even the terms greater than or less than is academic vocabulary, as would be product or factor or sum or addend or any of those terms. In prompt 4, they want you to make the connection between specific language and also language functions and how it's supporting learning towards the understandings that you have described. And this is complicated and complex. And there is a separate video on academic language that I want to refer you to that will address this fuller. Because the academic language section is the same for every endorsement, except I believe for special education. And it's tricky. So I'm going to talk about it briefly here, but I do encourage you to go back and look at the academic language video and also at some of the other academic language supports that have been provided for you. But the first thing you should know is that 4A asks about language function. What is the purpose of language in my discipline? Why do we use language? In math, we often use language to describe. That has 3 sides. It's a triangle. We might use math to compare. Oh, look, this is larger or is of greater value than this. We might use math to explain. Use language rather to explain our math. There are many different verbs that might fit in here. And the language function is going to be the same, or the same verbs will be available in pretty much every discipline. In every discipline, language is used to describe. In every discipline, language is used to compare or to contrast. In every discipline, language is used to interpret or categorize or justify. So the verbs that you see here, they listed some samples here. These verbs often align with the verbs that show up in learning targets. So when it asks about language function, you think, what am I trying to have students do? I'm trying to have them, they're trying to identify maybe which fraction is larger. Oh, so they're trying to compare and contrast. Okay, that's really the function of language in the central focus that I am teaching. So that's what that means when it talks about language function. And then in 4B, it asks you to identify, well, where does that happen in my lesson plans? Specifically, which learning task is going to be focusing on teaching students to use language to accomplish that skill we just talked about? That's the main thing, language function. But 4C asks about additional language demands. So given the language function, a learning task, let's say the language function was compare and contrast, what other associated language demands are there? Is there any specific vocabulary involved? Well, we already talked about the greater than and less than and the symbols, so you might want to bring those up. And then it asks about syntax and or discourse. And I'm not going to talk about those right now. Instead, I will refer you to the academic language video and to the academic language resources in which syntax and discourse will be described. And vocabulary and language function will also be described more fully. And then language supports, which is prompt 4D, asks you to refer back to your instructional materials and lesson plans to talk about where you're going to scaffold and support students' development or use of this language. So it's not just that you said, well, you have to use it, but how have you assisted them in using language in these discipline-specific ways? So again, the pro tips in this case are going to point you back to the other resources that are available to you, because this is complicated enough that it merits its own video. You always, as again, need to direct people back to specific elements of your learning targets or lesson plans or other instructional materials that support language function. And finally, you need to explicitly, notice that that's underlined, discuss language function, vocabulary and symbols, and either syntax or discourse. Sometimes people address 2 and not more than 2, and you have to address more than 2. If you do not, you will not score well on the related rubrics to this. So I just want to highlight that you need to do language function, vocabulary and or symbols, and then either syntax or discourse. But again, refer back to the other resources to gain a fuller understanding of how this works. Prompt 5, which is the last prompt, asks about assessment. how are we monitoring what students have learned, or how will we do this? So look at prompt 5A. Describe how your formal and informal assessments are going to provide direct evidence for you and your students to monitor conceptual understanding, computational and procedural fluency, and mathematical reasoning or problem-solving skills throughout the learning segment. What this is asking, regardless of which endorsement you're doing, how are the assessments you planned going to give evidence of the things that you said students are going to learn? In essence, they're asking you to justify that these assessments are going to give you the information you need to determine if students have learned the skills they need to learn. Why are these the right assessments? Why are they valid? Show that these assessments will do the job you say they're going to do. And notice that you have to address all of those things, and it can't just be a one-off. How is this happening throughout the learning segment? You need to talk about how you will adapt your assessments to allow students to demonstrate their specific understandings given their specific needs. And again, we have this highlighted section here. And then finally, in 5C, describe when and where you and the students will use tools or strategies to identify what's going well, what they still need to learn, what they need to improve with reflection and goal setting. When is that going to happen? Is it going to happen at the end of each lesson, midway through, formally, informally? So not only how are you assessing students and their knowledge, but how are you setting students up to have a constant cycle of formative assessment where they're checking in on their own progress and making minor adjustments and reflecting on what they've learned? How is this happening as a way of teaching, not simply as a one-off activity? This is prompt 5. And to me, this is very exciting because now this is about how we get to find out what students know and what they've learned and the progress they've made and how we are setting up those assessment systems. I like this. Pro tips. Refer to specific assessments that you have included in your assessment file. And you can also talk about possibly some informal assessments that may not have been included in the file, but that are going to be happening, like possibly maybe you're walking around and looking at student work, or you're going to do a quick thumbs up check, or other types of really simple formative assessments. You can refer to those even if they're not listed in the assessment file, but you should refer to also specific assessments that you have included in that file. And finally, be sure to address the students that you identified in your context for learning. Once again, we have this highlighted section, and it needs to be addressed. So, takeaways about the Task 1 commentary. Task 1 is a plan of what you will do. The way that edTPA works, ideally, is that you write Task 1 and you finish Task 1. Here is the plan I am making. Here's what I plan to do before you do it. So when you write this, you need to write it in I will language, in that future modality. This is what I will do. It is not a reflection on what you have done. It is a plan for what you will do. You need to be specific. You need to refer to specific students, not by name, of course, but refer to students with their specific needs and their specific knowledge bases and their specific understandings. And you need to be citing specific language from your lesson plans and specific elements of your instructional materials and assessments. And you need to be as specific as you can. This is about your actual students and their actual needs and the actual materials you are developing to meet those needs. Once again, use the language of the prompts. Your job will be easier, and the reader's job will be easier. And finally, make your connections and your justifications explicit. Do not leave it up to the reader to connect the dots between the instructional materials you designed and the specific prior knowledge of your students. You need to connect those two things explicitly. And explicit means you probably use the word connect. The connection between my students' prior knowledge and this instructional materials is, and then you explain it, citing specific evidence from both. These are the takeaways. Task 1 is doable. Task 1 is a plan. here's how I'm going to approach this. Tasks 2 and 3 take a look back. So what actually happened? So that's one of the big differences. Task 1 is a plan. Task 2 is, oh, so here's what I did. And task 3 is, so how did my students do? Did they actually get where I thought we were going to go? But right now, the plan. Here's where we plan to go. Here's why it's the right direction to head. And here's how we plan to get there. And the commentary simply connects all those dots. Have fun.